Right about now.
Right about now.
You're about to witness
The Funk Soul Brother.
Jonathan Small.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to the Right About Now podcast. This is John Small. On today's episode, we're going to hear the extraordinary story of Catherine Coldstream, who joined an ancient and secretive Carmelite monastery in the UK when she was just 27 years old and surrendered herself completely to a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But years into leading this sheltered and isolated life of a silent nun, she began to see the complexities and the dangers of the life that she vowed to live. Her experience is captured beautifully in a new memoir called Cloistered, My Years as a Nun. Spoiler alert, Catherine fled the monastery and she now teaches theology at Oxford. I found the book completely fascinating, not only because it opens the doors, or I guess the grill, to a hidden world, but also because of her inner and outer struggle to be selfless without really losing her sense of self. Throughout the book, she walks this fine line of doing what she is asked to do, to be obedient in the name of God, but also realizing the potential for mind control and being subjected to cruelty and just the destructiveness that comes with closed groups. Now, this book really resonated with me because of my own experience within a high control group in my teens and in my 20s. Now, I've talked about my involvement with what we sometimes call the brotherhood or the unfoldment. And what began for many, including me, as an honest exploration to find a higher purpose in life, ultimately became a cult of personality that involved backstabbing, fear, double standards, public shaming, and an unquestioned and unchecked authority. And this is a recipe for disaster. Now, I'm not saying that Catherine was in a cult, but it definitely had some of the ingredients of cult-like behavior. Anyway, in our conversation, we talk about the events that led to her joining the priory, the process of getting accepted, what exactly happens in a silent monastery, her views on celibacy and isolation from the outside world, self-surrender, and ultimately what led her to lead the life, as the nuns used to call it. So without further ado, I bring you my interview with Catherine Coldstream. Catherine Coldstream, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
Hello, John. It's fantastic to be here. Thank you.
Well, what an honor to meet you. It is just such a beautiful book that you have written. And not only written, but like we said before we started rolling tape here, that you read. I have listened to you for the last week on my long pondering walks around my neighborhood. And you're really a beautiful reader as well. You should be an actor.
Well, that's so kind of you. I mean, it's amazing to think that sitting here in Oxford, there's somebody in Los Angeles,
yes, that's where I am,
who's listening to my voice, reading that whole book. It's amazing. Thank you. I mean, I did the recording back in December down in London in the Penguin Studios, and I really enjoyed it. All
right. So if you could just sort of take us back before your early life, because people might be surprised to know your background. It's not maybe what one would associate with the typical somebody who becomes a nun and joins a convent. So tell me a little bit about your childhood, your early years, your teen years, who your parents were, what your family was like.
Yes. Well, I wasn't a typical nun in that I didn't come from a Catholic background. And I grew up in London. So my parents were quite an eccentric and quite bohemian couple. The very unusual thing was my dad was a generation older than my mother. So my father was, late 50s when I was born, and my mum was in her mid 20s. So they were nearly 30 years apart.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. And I had, after that, two siblings. So they had the three of us all quite rapidly in a row. But my father had two much older half sisters who were actually my mother's age group. I mean, I had much older half sisters who were his daughters from his first marriage, who were my mother's age group. So they were kind of like aunts. And they were already married by the time we were even born. So it was quite eccentric from that point of view. And my dad was a painter, and the head of the Slade School of Fine Art, which is part of University College London. So he was basically an art professor and a teacher and a painter, and lived a very, very interesting life, surrounded by other artists and quite a lot of sort of the intellectuals of UCL at London. My mother was an opera singer and an actress, and very different from Dad. She was often away. She'd go away traveling to do singing and performing. And my parents had separate bedrooms because the marriage did quite quickly become less than happy. So we grew up in quite a sort of fractured household.
Very artistic household, though. You are and were an artist. You played the viola and...
Yeah, well, I grew up crazy about, well, first ballet and then music. I got really into orchestral playing violin and viola in my teens, and got really into piano and composition. So I was at a boarding school, which, over here, it's probably more people have their boarding school experience over here, I guess, than in the States.
But I think so. Seems to have started there.
Yeah, it's an old-fashioned way of life now, and it's a bit of a weird one. But I did go to boarding school, and being very homesick, I lost myself in classical music because I had a fantastic, inspiring music teacher who I wanted to please and impress, I guess. And I really loved music, and it gave me a wonderful escape. A bit like, later on, I found, I needed that transcendence that I later found in religion. So I found it in music. I was going to go to university to study music, but various crises in the family happened, and I dropped out of my university course really early on. And my father became ill, the house was sold, all sorts of stuff was going on. So I did external diploma studies at the Guildhall, which means I was doing that alongside working for a music publisher, got very into contemporary music, contemporary classical. So, sort of Boulez, Stockhausen, heritage.
So it's a very avant-garde, not your traditional interest.
Yeah.
But then you have a profound change in your life. Your father passes away. And talk about that experience and how that changed really the trajectory of your life.
Well, it was when I was actually in Paris, because some of my studies took me to Paris, and I'd been living there for quite a while. My dad had been going downhill for years. He started going downhill when I was about 20, and then when I was 24, he died. And this was a complete crisis for me. I mean, obviously, it's devastating to lose a parent. And, I was quite a vulnerable, sort of, quite turbulent young person. And it just felt like the universe had just stopped. Everything suddenly changed for me in my life then. Somehow or other, I have some sort of, for want of a better expression, an experience of God, an experience of the divine, which really changed me on the spot, really, when my father died. And after that, although music was still very, very important for me, I started searching much more into world religions and looking at different religions, and particularly I started close to home with sort of Anglican C of E religion. But the more I read about it, the more I felt that its roots were in Catholicism, and I wanted to find out about Catholicism. And there was a whole period of a couple of years after my father died when a lot of things happened to me that really moved me in the direction of Catholicism and of, searching for a deep, meaningful life through prayer and faith.
What was it about Catholicism specifically? Because a lot of people, when they're searching, like you were searching, my parents, by the way, also had a search similar to this, but their path was very different because they found like a spiritual teacher. And, a lot of people, they'll find like Eckhart Tolle, or they'll find these kind of like more new age type of, not as traditional as one might say, but what is it about Catholicism?
I think it was often things go step by step. So when I first thought, right, okay, there's obviously a God. I've had some sort of experience that's taken me right outside of time and space. It was when I saw my father's body. It was as though I realized there was an eternal dimension and my father's soul lived on. And so I was convinced that there was a divine presence and a divine dimension. So the first thing I thought was, well, maybe this is something to do with religion. I mean, after all, that's what religion purports to be all about. So I thought I'd start by going back to the Church of England to see what I could find out. Wasn't immediately convinced that the experience of God I'd had was the same was, consonant with traditional religion. But I thought I'd try it out. Started asking questions, and I got involved in church then because I was very, very musical. So I got into the choir, and I really enjoyed the singing in what we call the Anglo-Catholic Church over here. I don't know quite what you call it over there, but it's like the Catholic end of the Episcopal or Anglican Church. Yeah, so they have a lot of emphasis on music and ritual. So I sort of naturally found myself in a very Catholic style worship because of all the music that I was enjoying.
Right, music was
but
your
then
entry.
and then I started thinking, well, what's the difference between the high end of the Catholic Church, of the Anglican Church, and the Roman Catholic Church? And one thing I did was read sort of about the early church history, and I realized that the roots of the Anglican, faith were actually in Roman Catholicism. And although it felt a bit alien, it was really when I paid a visit to a local community of religious sisters who were helping the homeless in London. And I joined with them for a couple of weekends of just being a volunteer with them. I was absolutely bowled over by their example. I mean, they were so earnest, they were so sincere. The work they were doing on the streets with the poor was incredible. And I just thought, hang on, this is much more real than what was going on in a very precious church setting. So actually, my first conversion to Catholicism, first influence really, well, apart from meeting a nun on a train, which was also an important influence, we had a long conversation, but meeting these nuns in London who were working with the poor really made me think these are radical people. These are people who are living their faith and practice what they preach. And that compared at that time to me as a very idealistic young person, quite favourably with a much more sort of comfortable seeming church that I'd grown up knowing. So I got involved in Catholicism then. And then other things that really appealed about Catholicism were, well, the emphasis on prayer, but also I think that the seriousness with which Catholics took their faith and the fact that when you start looking into what Catholicism actually teaches, although there are loads of problems with Catholicism in practice, and the Catholic Church obviously has got massive problems, when you actually look at the teaching, there is a sort of satisfying coherence to the way it's all been presented theologically. And I found I enjoyed the philosophical side of it. I enjoyed reading about how, well, I felt it was more convincing, a religion that could present itself philosophically. If you look at the Thomas Aquinas and the sort of historic theologians of the Catholic Church, they were really going for coherence. And although that doesn't sit easily with the modern world, to an idealistic youngster, that can seem like quite impressive. And it did it, but I thought, well, but this all seems to hang together. I didn't mind that it meant turning my back on the world and on so much that would make for a sort of naturally fulfilling life at that point, because I was just really driven to find the truth. And I just went down that route rather obsessively.
Yes. And in a very, like you said, obsessively, but also in a very austere and serious path.
Yeah.
You didn't play around. We will get right back to my conversation with Catherine Coldstream. But first, I have some really big news to share. I have a new book coming out in May. That is right. And I would be absolutely honored if you would be part of what I call a book launch squad. You can do this for free. Okay, first, the book. It's called, surprise, surprise, Right About Now, Best-Selling Authors on Origin Stories, Creative Inspiration, and the Birth of Their Careers. And it is basically a collection of stories told by my many incredible guests on the surprising and unexpected ways that they got started in writing. I think you'll find it very encouraging and inspiring. I certainly did. Okay, so what does it mean to be part of my book launch squad? I had no idea either. So let me explain what my publishers have told me. A launch squad is a group of people who read an early and basically free copy of my book and review it on Amazon. And all you have to do is purchase the ebook for about 99 cents on Amazon when the time comes and leave a review. If you want to be part of this, I'm going to leave a link in the podcast description, and I will also email out a link in my newsletter, which is called Small Talk. All you have to do is leave us your email address, and we will get in touch with you when the time comes. So excited. Thank you for being a part of this huge moment in my career. All right, now back to the podcast. So one of the things that I was curious to know is that, I think we think of convents, we think of orders as very like, okay, well, there's one type. I don't know, I'm a Jew, so of course I don't know a lot about any of this, but my always idea was that if you were a nun, you were a nun. There weren't all these different orders, different beliefs, practices and then you decide actually to join a silent Carmelite order.
Mm.
Tell us about that specific order appeal to you.
Yeah, well, there are loads of different orders, and the Carmelite one is one of the more austere,
yes,
and it's one of the more contemplative. So I liked I was very drawn to the silence and the sense of being a hermit in community. So the Carmelite order is based on this idea of the hermit life, which goes right back to Anthony of Egypt and the early church. But the Carmelites revived this sense of the hermit life in the 12th and 13th centuries on Mount Carmel in Israel. And it actually, because of that, it has a lot more connection with the Hebrew Bible than some of the other orders. It's very biblical. It's very rooted in Elijah, for example. Elijah on the mountaintop, Elijah seeking God, through the still
Elijah is
small
my
voice.
son's name, by the way. So I love that you keep saying the word Elijah.
Well, great. Elijah is absolutely, he's absolutely the contemplative of,
yes.
The first prophet of Israel, really, and the contemplative on the mountaintop. He's that model. And he was really important for us as Carmelites. I found that very appealing because I kind of went into the whole prayer thing very intensively, and I felt very drawn to silent prayer. So the Carmelites are the order that goes, well, there are one or two orders, the Carthusians and the Carthusians are also very, very silent, but we had a strong emphasis on a silent life, yet trying to live in community at the same time, which was a real challenge.
What do you mean by silent prayer?
Oh, gosh. Well, we were silent nearly all the time while we were working, but there were 2 hours a day when we had complete silent prayer. It's often called contemplative prayer, and it often starts with a time of meditation on the words of the liturgy, which was mostly Psalms, again, mostly Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, old, sort of Psalms readings, and New Testament, of course. But there was a lot of pondering the words very slowly, very inwardly, and this could lead into a kind of prayer that was wordless and very simple. Teresa of Avila, who was the big reformer of the Carmelite movement, described prayer as just an easy sort of conversation with someone who we know loves us. So it's regarding God as someone who loves you and you just want to hang out with him, spend time with him, bask in his love. That's kind of the model, really. Another kind of description is the prayer of simple attention, which means beyond words, you're just giving attention to that presence that is somehow there for you. In a monastery, everything's set up so that, to facilitate the sense of presence and the sense of giving attention to God. So it's not a complicated thing. It's a very simple.
It sounds a lot like meditation in Buddhism, right? Very much like meditation.
It is very much like meditation, yes. Yeah.
Can you take us through a little bit of the process? So once you discover this Carmelite order, you don't just immediately get accepted. There's a kind of trial run. Can you take us through some of the various steps that one needs to take? Because it's not an easy journey by any means, what you had to kind of do and sacrifice. So can you explain that a little bit to us?
Yes. Well, the first thing is you have to be a Catholic. So
I would not qualify, and a woman probably, right?
And you have to. There are men's order. There are men's. Obviously, you have to be a woman to enter but there are friars.
Yes,
you can become a friar.
You can become a friar.
But to enter a community of nuns, Carmelite nuns, I mean, obviously you have to be a Catholic. So that for me was the first big hurdle, and it was because I felt so drawn to sort of a life of dedication to God, which by that time had become really like an all-consuming objective for me. I felt that was, I thought this will make sense of life for me. This will give me a purpose that is greater than all other purposes, So I was very, very keen on it, very zealous. But I was still an Anglican. But once becoming a nun did start looking like a possibility, and I realised that it was I felt I was being called to do, or that was the right thing to do. I had to become a Catholic, and I looked into I went to a course called Instruction at Westminster Cathedral in London. I was living in London. So I went to Westminster Cathedral to all these sessions with a group called the RCIA. It's the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults, I think. And I went to all these, and I also supplemented that with lots of sort of conversations with Catholics and priests and reading. And after, quite a long time of doing that and becoming more immersed in the sort of Catholic lifestyle, I was received into the church and became Catholic. By then, I had also started visiting a particular Carmelite monastery that I entered later on. I've called it Akenside Priory in the book. And yes, you're right, you don't just walk in. So you have to be a Catholic, but you also have to be free of debt, free of dependencies, have to have good health. So you have to have sort of medical checks, reference from your priest, quite a lot of preliminary stuff. Then you go for 2 weeks just to live inside as though you were a nun. You get sort of given a cell and you live as much of the timetable as you can. And you really get a very, very strong sense then of whether it is for you. So, but even to get that far, you have to have the bishop's permission and things. It's because of the cloistered life. It's very cut off from the outside world. So I went in and I did my 2 weeks and I was absolutely bowled over. And it was all I wanted to do was to enter this community and stay forever. But you have to wait a bit and they vote. There's sort of more mature sisters who've made their life vows are called the chapter sisters. And the chapter of the monastery has to vote and let you in. So they voted and then eventually you're on tenterhooks and then you get a letter saying you've been accepted. And then they set a date. Once you enter, there's a 6-month period where you're just wearing your own clothes for 6 months, and then you're called a postulant. And after 6 months as a postulant, if they vote for you, you get given the Carmelite habit in a ceremony called the clothing. When you're clothed in the habit, then you really feel you've been completely accepted into the Carmelite life, and you are one of the community. But there's another 5 years to go of training. Well, it wasn't called training, it's called formation. So it was very much about reforming your mind and your habits and your heart and your whole way of thinking. I mean, you are reprogrammed. You are reprogrammed to a completely different goal in life. And it's not just about prayer and God, it's about adopting the whole mindset of the Carmelite traditions and being part of this particular community. So there's a positive side. Of course, there's a side which potentially is quite can have negative sides.
And I want to get into that because
let's not get into that. But basically, you do that. You become a novice, and you have. In my case, there were 2 years of being a novice before I took temporary vows for 3 years. And after the temporary vows for 3 years, you wait 3 years, and if you're voted in, you get to become a full chapter sister. It's a very long, slow process.
And the vows are poverty, chastity, obedience, right? Those are the three.
Yes, and correct, because lots of people I've spoken to think there's a vow of silence, but there isn't. Yeah.
Okay. But you are silent. I was trying to get a sense in reading your book of what a day might be like for you. Like you wake up, silent prayer, working. Like, can you sort of take us through maybe like a typical day in the life there?
Yeah.
And by the way, it's called The Life. The nuns call it The Life.
Oh, yes, The Life. So The Life was this absolutely wonderful thing that was, seen as completely sacred. So a typical day, and nearly every day was typical. You woke at 5:15 to the sound of the matrack, which is kind of like a lot of the things in the life were very medieval. So it was a very ancient rattle that made the most incredibly loud noise. And the floor would shake. One sister would patrol the dormitory corridors and ring this rattle. So you jumped out of bed straight away. You had to get straight out of bed. And you were in your cell on your own. Everyone had their own cell. You jumped out of bed, dedicated the day to God, washed in a bucket of cold water, dried yourself with a tiny little bit of towel, and threw on your habit. And 25 minutes later, you were kneeling in the choir, which was the name we gave to the nuns' chapel, which was downstairs, great big hall-like room. It was attached to the public chapel, but we didn't often have visitors. We just had a few visitors to the chapel. So the choir was at right angles to that, so people couldn't really see us. And we were behind bars called the Grill. And we started the day with Lauds, which is the traditional name for morning prayer. And this was the first of 7. We call them the monastic hours, which are like little, we also call them offices. So they were like little services, perhaps 15, 20 minutes each, made up of sung psalms and hymns and readings. The first one was Lauds at about 5:45 in the morning. And these other ones followed throughout the day. And the day was really just divided between these times of prayer when we'd all go very formally into the choir in procession and we'd sing and recite these prayers and these psalms. And in between this, there were slices of either work or reading. Yeah, that was the main thing. So after morning prayer, we'd have a whole hour of silent prayer. And then we'd have a very quick, light bite of bread and some tea. And then we'd have some work and then mass, a daily mass. So basically the day was just divided up into intense times of prayer and mass and silent reading and silent prayer. I forgot to say that. So 2 hours a day of silent prayer, an hour a day of silent reading. And all the work was very simple manual work that was supposed to be done in silence as well. So it's stuff like gardening or cooking or sewing. Everything was done in solitude. If you were occasionally working in the same room or the same bit of garden as somebody else, you did so in a way that you didn't speak to them. You just got on with your work mostly. And we just had half an hour after supper in the evening when we met together as a group and the silence was lifted and people chatted for half an hour. It's called recreation, which was a very weird time because it was so different from the rest of the day. And then you'd end up with compline, which was night prayer, and going to bed.
Yeah. What was the ultimate goal here? What is everybody aspiring to? And what were you aspiring to as far in your practice and your worship?
Yes. Yeah. Well, we called it union with God.
Mm-hmm.
So that sounds incredibly sort of lofty and ambitious. It was union with God is something, Teresa of Avila talks about a lot, writes about, and John of the Cross. So these were the Carmelite writers who inspired the whole goal. They were from the 16th century. We were living a bit as though we were still, certainly pre-modern. And for them, the idea of union with God was a very real thing that could happen through prayer, which is why we had so much prayer, but also through, the biggie really was obedience. For the Carmelite charism, as we call it, the tradition of our order, the concept that you could be united with God by conforming your will to the will of God, which was another way of saying obeying God. And this was mediated almost exclusively through the prioress.
Who's sort of the head. She was the head of the...
She was like the mother. She was the mother superior. We called her the prioress. They were voted in. The prioresses were voted in. Every 3 years there were elections. So there was meant to be a bit of a turnover. In practice, it didn't always happen that often that there was a new prioress. But the prioress was seen as standing in God's place and you obeyed her. So this is a very radical way of life I was there in the 1990s, but it was still very radical then. And union with God was meant to happen by completely conforming your will to God's will. And what was encouraged in the order, in the writings of the order, and also in my particular community by the prioress and the sisters who were in charge of the formation process, and it was all pretty traditional, they often encouraged us to see obedience and conforming our wills to God with something that had to pass through sort of being purified of yourself and being somehow putting your own self aside. So there was this very stringent tradition of sort of self-denial and sacrifice, and almost having to, parts of yourself were really almost having to be destroyed in order to allow you, in order to enable that conformity with, whether you see it as conformity with God's will, or just conformity with the community and its sort of traditions. There are two ways of looking at it. And, with hindsight, I can see that there are dangers, but that is what we did.
There were dangers, and you weren't, allowed to talk about your feelings, particularly, of course. That's not really right. Was not a topic that you would talk about that freely with the other nuns. Like that was frowned upon.
You never talked. No, you didn't talk about your feelings. You weren't really meant to talk about yourself. You were meant to put yourself aside. So there was a sort of ascetical, almost punitive. They wouldn't have called it punitive. They would have called it ascetical, but it was sort of it was you were waging war on your individual self
The
in
ego.
order to let
Yeah.
the image of Christ come through. So there was definitely a crushing and destruction of the self, which psychologically for some people was very damaging. Of course, it could, if you were a very robust person, you could survive this and you could somehow come out, it's like character formation, basically. And, to lesser extents, this sort of thing happens, I guess, in the army and in all sorts of institutions, but it was pretty tough when I was there. Yeah.
And I'm sure, vows of celibacy. I mean, the idea that you can't have an intimate relationship with anybody now for the rest of your life, or really that much contact with the outside world. Did that weigh on you, or was that something that you found very challenging?
Well, you know what? It didn't bother me at all.
That's interesting.
And I think, I didn't bother me at all. I think until maybe after I've been there quite a few years, you'd have the odd little sort of wistful daydream of, what would it be like, if I, would it be like, what would have happened if I got married? But I wasn't someone who had those thoughts a lot. I think some nuns do feel more, some nuns maybe are people who've had to struggle more with a strong sense of wanting a family of their own, and then they've renounced that. I never felt family life was for me because my own family was so dysfunctional, and my own mother was not very happily married. And I spent my whole life missing my dad, and I was more interested in finding my father. For me, God was where my father was in heaven, and it was kind of like having a deep relationship with the perfect father. And that for me was something that became really quite disembodied and spiritual. I think looking back, it is quite odd that I didn't ever really miss intimacy, consciously miss it. And I think maybe I'd repressed, perhaps that was a bit of a repressed part of me, but I really loved the solitude, and I loved all the time for reflection and prayer. I loved the ritual, and there was so much in the life that really supported my kind of personality. I mean, I think towards the end, I probably would have admitted to myself I really did need somebody to talk to, and somebody who understood, and somebody kind to talk to, and that sort of thing. But I probably wouldn't have admitted it to myself because I was trying so hard to be a good Carmelite.
Yeah.
That's probably the reason, yeah.
Did you have contact with your family during this time? Did people come and visit you, or were you was that not looked favorably upon?
You could have what was called a parlour, which meant your family or any other sort of close friends or relatives. It's very restricted. They could come and see you for a short time in the parlour, which were these rooms where the room was divided in two by the grill, which was the bars. So you could only see them through the grill. And when I was there, they brought in a novelty, which was there was a bit of grill you could take out, so you could passing through and even have a little hug. But that was really quite a late development. Yeah. And what it was traditionally, I think it was half an hour a month you could have in the parlour with your family. Well, my family didn't necessarily live very near, and my family were very scattered anyway. So if your family didn't visit very often, instead of half an hour a month, you could have something like an hour and a half, twice a year. But I mean, in my case, I probably had about I might have had 3 visits from my sister, who was my closest relative for a long time. And occasionally one from my mother sometimes came up, but not very often. I might have had 3 or 4 parlours a year, which might have been an hour or 2. But it's all very restricted.
And always through the grill. I mean, when you said pieces taken out, but always through these bars. And sometimes you said like bishops would also come and visit just to kind of check up on you and right.
They should have checked up on us a bit more. I mean, there was a bishop. Obviously, every diocese has a bishop. The bishop came occasionally, and he'd sometimes come just on a sort of social visit and just sort of, we'd always be very much on our best behaviour, just best sort of, you put on your best sandals and play some music to him, and he'd be feted like a sort of emperor, well, he would be a very important guest. Sometimes it was just social. Sometimes he would come and want to talk to us about our spiritual lives, but not very often. His delegate, who was a monk, sometimes came, but again, it was all very stilted. You couldn't really have a free conversation.
I thought it was funny. I think at one point you mentioned that one of the bishops was kind of handsome, visited, and then all the nuns would sort of be a titter about it. I thought that they were every so often.
He wasn't a bishop. He was actually quite a young priest, and everyone thought he was really cool because he was wearing Birkenstocks. And he used to talk about the lotus posture and stuff.
Oh, right.
There was a bit of a flurry of yoga after he came, and everyone was sort of trying to be very hip. But yeah, no, that was true, and I think he was quite popular.
Yeah.
The ritual was that every 3 years you were meant to have an official inspection from either the bishop or his delegate. And it was done by what we called the visitation. So they were meant to come, and they never came inside the enclosure. Even they were outside on the other side of the grill. But you could have a conversation one-to-one with them when they had the visitation. And the point of it was they were meant to ask every nun, whether she was happy. And it was a chance for any nun to talk in confidence to them about things you wouldn't normally have a chance to talk about, or that the priors didn't pass on to him. So it should be a chance for the hierarchy to know if there's anything bad going on, or anything that needs addressing, and to prevent things from getting really unhealthy in closed communities who have very inward looking lives. But in practice, whenever we had the visitation, we were sort of strongly encouraged not to speak freely with them, and just to sort of keep the conversation to a minimum, and not to say anything that might sound negative. So in reality, it was a bit of a formality, and the priests and the bishops didn't really get that close to us or our world.
And if you did say anything maybe negative, it might get back right to the prioress, and it would get back.
Yeah. Yes. It would be anonymous. They were meant to feed back to the prioress afterwards if there was anything, they'd feedback. The ideal for the prioress would be that the bishop would say, "Oh, you've got a wonderfully united community, and everyone's very happy and contented, and that's great." But they might feed back to her something like, "Well, some of the sisters are feeling concerned about something or other," and then there'd be a final session where he'd sort of give some feedback to the community. But this was meant to be a chance to sort of, as a healthy checkup for the community every 3 years. But because closed communities have got a very strong mystique about them, and the priests often feel they're not really equipped to interfere behind the grill and everything, these communities can actually become very much laws unto themselves.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Obviously, you are no longer with this order. But you loved it at first, and it was actually, I'm sure you still look back on it very fondly as an incredible transformative experience in your life. But what changed for you?
Yes, I did love it at first. It was always difficult. Obviously, it's meant to be difficult, but I liked a challenge. I think after I'd been there about 2.5 years was when I was coming up for, no, not 2.5, that was, yes, 2.5, 3 years. I was coming up for my first vows. That's when I suddenly thought, oh my gosh, help, what's going on? Because I suddenly felt, I'd been trying so hard to be this perfect nun, and that's what you do in those sort of orders. Nobody walks lightly into that way of life. So you're trying very hard. But so I was probably I've been bottling up my feelings and any sort of worries. I've been sort of sweeping under the carpet, so to speak. I think it all suddenly hit me in the face about 2.5 years in that this was a really, potentially irrevocable decision. And I suddenly started realizing it was much more emotionally difficult than I had ever imagined it would be. And that was really not because of the ideals of the Carmelite life or the prayer life. It was more to do with living with a particular group of people whose personalities and mentalities were so unfamiliar to me and so different from my own. And I'm feeling quite alienated and quite hurt really by, the tensions in the community and the way people behaved. And that was quite bruising to me. I found there was a lot more suffering engendered by aspects of community life and how people treated you and behaved towards you. That was very hard indeed. The feeling of coldness and rejection you got from some people, and then sort of scornful feelings of people who sort of, might betray little antipathies or whatever. And then I think that struggle, which in itself, you should be able to cope with spiritually as kind of a way of, going to deeper prayer. And obviously you do try to go down that route. But then I think later on, when that became combined with starting noticing things that seemed like discrepancies between what was said and what was done, and double standards and things like that, I really did start having doubts about the community. And I thought maybe another monastic community would have been better, but at that time I didn't feel I could rock the boat by asking. I just kept thinking I must persevere.
It's important to me that the supplements I take are of the highest quality. And AG1 is researched and developed by an in-house team of scientists and doctors and nutritionists with decades of experience in their respective fields. Taking care of my health shouldn't be complicated. And AG1 simplifies this by making sure there aren't like a zillion different pills and capsules to keep track of. Just one scoop of AG1 mixed with my smoothie every day. And I love that scoop also includes prebiotics and probiotics and digestive enzymes for my grouchy gut. Now, I've partnered with AG1 because they make a high quality product that I genuinely look forward to drinking every day. So if you want to replace your multivitamin and more, start with AG1. And I've got a special deal for you. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3 and K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription. Here's what you do. You go to drinkag1.com/rightaboutnow. That's drinkag1.com/rightaboutnow. Check it out now. You started with one prioress and then another one comes in and you do not jibe as well with this person. And as you said in the interview, in the beginning of this interview, the prioress sort of becomes almost the embodiment of God to you, right? So if this person is a mirror back to you of yourself and you're not feeling that you are connecting with this person or this person even likes you, do you start thinking, well, God doesn't like me? Do you start sort of beating yourself up like that?
No, that doesn't, no, that's not how it seemed at all. I think the thing was, it wasn't that there was a new prioress who I didn't get on with. It was it wasn't like that. No, there was a new prioress and she was, in many ways, I thought good news, very good news. She was bringing in a breath of fresh air and wanting to shake things up a bit and change things, which I was perfectly open to. But some of the sisters were very against it because they were very stuck in the Akenside ways. It was like, we've always done things this way. Mm-hmm. This is the Akenside way. And the new prioress was quite a shock to some of the sisters because she was a little bit more progressive. She was more intellectual. She wanted to, she was more sort of steeped in the kind of post-Vatican II teachings, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. The Vatican II was the 1960s changes in the Catholic Church that came in at the Second Vatican Council. So she was more progressive, and that was a big threat to some of the sisters who really liked the way the previous priors had done everything and didn't want anything to change. I actually was fine with the change of priors, but it did trigger a big crisis in the community.
Yeah,
But
there was
the
like a
other part-
mutiny almost, right? There was the two camps.
Yeah. The other part of your question, though, was like whether the prioress, whether it mattered if you didn't feel she liked you. I think I kind of felt the second prioress actually was more sympathetic to me. The first one, everybody loved her, Mother Elizabeth, in the book. She was a lovable, charismatic person, but she did play people off against each other, and she was very, how can I put it? She didn't like listening or having dialogue. She was quite autocratic, you know. It was very, very, what she said went, and that she was very starchy and very cold towards me. So that was quite difficult. But I don't think it was ever the case that you thought the prioress was a mirror back to you of yourself. It wasn't that. When they said they represented God, it wasn't that you had a relationship with them that was like your prayer life. That was very separate. But it was more that she was more or less, it wasn't like that. It was more like the prioress was simply the one who was institutionally in charge. And whether you got on with her or whether she seemed to like you or not was meant to be kind of irrelevant.
So you saw a lot of things happening with the other nuns that you didn't like, that you felt like it was a double standard, you said.
Yes.
And why didn't you, there were other orders that you could join. Why did you stick this one out? And then, you know, why did you decide to stay there?
Well, I did wonder sometimes whether another order or another monastery would be better. And looking back, I realised, of course, I should have just said this really straight. But I felt it would have been a sort of failure of perseverance to give up. And you were sort of trained to think that you just had to keep going, you had to persevere no matter what. It was meant to be tough. So, you know, what was there to complain about? Some sisters did, you know, in the past, they'd transferred to one of the other monasteries of the Carmelite order. And a lot at one point had transferred to Melleby, which was another of the monasteries I talk about in the book, a slightly more liberal one. And I think if I'd been a bit more assertive and a little bit less precious about everything, I would have probably made a bit of more of an issue of it earlier on and said, look, there are things here that are really worrying me. I'd like to transfer somewhere else. But when one or two other sisters transferred, we were told immediately, that's it. Nobody else is going, you know, I'm not counting anyone else going to Melleby. And you just felt that, you know, it just wasn't allowed.
Yeah.
I realised looking back, technically it was allowed, and I should have really insisted on seeing, you know, talking to the bishop about it. But the prioress really discouraged it so strongly that you felt that it was sort of almost taboo.
Anyway, if you had done that, you wouldn't have been able to write this beautiful book. So I'm glad you didn't make that. What was there a moment or a series of moments that ultimately led to you just saying that I can no longer be here and I must leave?
Yeah, well, I described towards the end of the book how I ran away in the middle of the night, which obviously was dramatic.
You opened the book with that. Yeah, you opened the book.
Yeah, I open it and I bring it back full circle at the end. Well, yeah, typical me, I had to go overboard and do it the dramatic way. And later on, as you know, I went back, then I left through the official channels the second time round. I think I just got to the point where I realised I was thinking either I'm going to go crazy, I'm going to commit suicide. And I thought, well, what's worse, committing suicide, going crazy, or leaving? And then I thought, come on, leaving can't be worse than those other things. And nobody wants to go crazy. I mean, looking back, I probably would have pulled through, but I would have been very crushed as a person because, you know, going back to my family, I'm actually a very sort of expressive person. And the fact that I've written this book, it's in my nature to be able to discuss things and express things. And, you know, the music as well, all this sort of stuff was being very repressed in the life. And the prioress didn't like us expressing ourselves. You were meant to hold it all in. And I think in the end, I had to actually just break out because it's just not in my nature to be that confined. I got a lot out of the discipline in the early years, but I think there was a point when it was no longer going to be good for me. And I just needed to realize I'd gained a lot of maturity and spiritual strength through the life. It had helped me get over my father's death. But there was a point when I just realized it was going to do me more harm than good staying. And I just had to get out.
Was it harder transitioning to the ordinary life than it was from the ordinary life to the monastic life? Like when re-entry into the real world, was that I think you describe, you know, the noises and the sound, you know, it's like, I don't have a completely similar experience, but I kind of know what you mean when you're in one kind of reality and then you go into this completely different reality. What was that like, the transition?
Yes. The transition back to the outside world was a mixed experience. So in some ways leaving is, I think in some ways leaving is as hard as entering. In some ways it's harder because when you enter, you're buoyed up by this great sense of hope of this wonderful life of dedication. And you've got a sort of unrealistic view of it and you're starry-eyed and the future is bright.
Yeah.
You've got the honeymoon period. When you're leaving, it's much more complex and you're facing the complexity and the reality of your psyche. Is you've come to a point probably where you're acknowledging the complexity psychologically and emotionally of what you've taken on, and you realize it's much harder and it's perhaps untenable for you. Whereas when you go in, you're probably in denial about a lot of the difficulties. So it's harder to leave in the sense of that before you actually leave, making the decision and talking it through with the prioress and the bishops and actually getting to that point where you say, okay, I'm ready to leave. It's heartbreaking because you've staked your whole life on this and it's been your whole life. It's not just a job or a place to live or even just a community. It's your whole identity is tied up with it because you've been cut off from the outside world. It is everything. It's your home. It's what you do. It's who you are. And when you take off the habit for the first time, it's absolutely devastating because the habit is your identity and it's part of your identity, but it symbolizes who you are. And suddenly you just are completely adrift in the outside world. So there was a part of leaving that was really heartbreaking and you missed the stability and the routines and the beauty of the liturgy and there was so much in the life that was beautiful. On the other hand, there was this great sense of relief that you're away from the things that were causing you mental or emotional pressure or suffering. And finally, you could breathe freely. You could talk freely. So when I left, I enjoyed things like long conversations with my sister, and we just sit up into the night laughing. I could laugh about things that I hadn't laughed about for years. I could suddenly relax. My God, you let down your guard, and that was great. It was fun just doing stuff like being physically free enough to just sort of go for walks, do whatever you feel like. I don't know, just going to the shops, going out for meals and things like that was lovely. And of course, I enjoyed my first sort of, I don't know, going out for a pint of beer with a friend. Like that.
That must have been interesting.
Great.
Yeah,
it was great. So there was a great sense of I think there was part of leaving was euphoric because suddenly you were free. Suddenly, I went in my late 20s. You come out sort of 12 years later and you're still like, if anything, you're like a child because you're treated very much like there was an aspect in the old days when I was there where you are treated like a child and you come out and you're like somebody much, much younger than their years, very, very naive. I hadn't aged really. I hadn't aged in the normal way. I hadn't taken on responsibilities in life. So I came out age 39, really like somebody much younger and feeling life was all ahead of me. And part of me felt really excited and euphoric and happy to have the freedom. But another part of you really missed the life and felt awful at everything that you'd thrown it away or you'd sort of somehow failed to persevere. And it's an awful sense of guilt that you feel about that and quite a strong pull to go back to it all the time because the formation is like a complete reprogramming of your mind. So being out was very mixed. It's taken me years. I mean, I've been out over 20 years now, and it's taken me years to process all that I went through to the point where I could, produce, I started writing about my experiences very early on, but actually getting to the stage where I felt it could all come together in one volume that had a coherence and a meaningful story arc that I could let go of really has been important. It's been a very long process. And adapting to things like, just ordinary things like the noise and dealing with money and dealing with sort of,
life was a lot simpler on the inside, I guess, right?
All these things were very difficult. I think the noise was something I found very difficult outside.
It's interesting. I lived in Japan for a year. And then when I came back to New York, oh my goodness, I don't know why. I just freaked out just because Japan was a lot cleaner, a lot more orderly. And then when I came back to New York, it was like New York just seems so chaotic to me, and dirty and smelly, and it was just I sort of can relate to that. So with this 20 years perspective now, you've used the word like programming and getting rid of the self. Do you think it's healthy? Like, do you think this practice is ultimately good for people? Because some of the techniques used, are similar to what cults would maybe, use.
Yes.
So what is your take on that?
I think with perspective, I would say there are aspects of the traditional monastic life that, were formed in medieval cultures. And whereas the rest of our cultures have moved on and evolved, one hopes with progressively better or healthier views of for example, the development of democracy and all the other ways society's changed. I think there's a lot that's really beautiful in monastic life and that I still feel was so important for me and that I still miss, actually, the sense of the sacred and dedication. But I think giving all power to one person in a closed community of, say, 20 others, and of the kind of mystique and specialness and inviolability that surrounds that one person who doesn't necessarily have any accountability if she's, not really questioned or interacted with in a sort of give and take way. I think there are a lot of dangers. Yes, I think there's a lot of danger in communities there are cult-like aspects to very closed communities. So, for example, a Carmelite monastery, the life in a Carmelite monastery is not actually typical of life in the Catholic Church in general, because there's a special charism in a monastery that is its own set of values and traditions passed on through the rule and the constitutions. These are not things that lay Catholics live by. And actually, if you look at the beliefs that underpin these, they're very different from some of the beliefs held in mainstream Catholicism. There's far more emphasis on denying the self and surrendering to obedience. And I think that there is a danger for people. I think it would be great if monastic life could somehow reimagine itself in a way that could be healthy for modern people in the modern world, that would emphasize all that was beautiful in a very formal and spiritually focused life, but with much more respect for the individual, the integrity of the individual, and allowing people, to speak and to be heard and to dialogue and to discuss, rather than to silence people and crush them. And I think I'm not saying monasticism is harmful per se, but I think it needs carefully to be adapted for each new generation. Otherwise, there are medieval parts of it where people are silenced, they're forced into making confessions, they are ostracized, and this can all be extremely harmful. And the other thing that can be very harmful in a closed community is cliques and the little hubs of sort of, little cliques that form around certain charismatic people that can then come into conflict with other cliques. So that can be incredibly toxic and it's very harmful. So I think the bishops and the delegates of the bishop in the outside world and the priests in general ideally should have a bit more access to the nuns and a bit more influence in sort of helping the nuns to grow in a healthy way rather than in a cut-off way that can allow for this sort of toxicity.
Yeah, you see it again and again that when you mix the human and the divine, and you give humans divine attributes or absolute attributes, like they say, absolute power corrupts absolutely oftentimes. And I think it is hard. You need to have checks and balances, it seems like. Otherwise yes. It can be potentially very dangerous.
I know others who've been in Carmel have somehow managed to deprogram themselves completely to the point of renouncing it all. I don't think I've been completely deprogrammed. I think there's part of me that's really still feels connected with it.
Yeah. Well, you teach theology. I mean, you believe that. I think that's the challenge, is that you join for the right reasons and you do have a passion for what you believe and are learning about, right? The Catholic religion and the teachings, but it's not absolute, right? There's not one truth. It's open to debate and discussion, and not everything. Some things are dated now, and I think it's when things become so rigid, that's when it gets tricky.
Yes, I mean, yes, when it's rigid and when it's the community thinks that they know better than the rest of the world and they're the only ones who got it right.
Yeah.
That's when it's really rings alarm bells. I'm much more cautious now about these things, and I think a lot about theology and about these things, but I'm much less likely to rush into anything headlong. So I go, I'm quite interested in the Quakers at the moment. And I'm interested, and I go to the Anglican Church and to the Catholic Church, at different times. I feel, I'd love to think that there was some perfect type of religious expression, or not even religious, but a community that supported the spiritual.
Yeah.
But I think I've seen enough of these, and I've spoken to enough people who've been to other monasteries, particularly, to realize that I think a lot of, probably all communities of human beings, when they're very closed off and they've got a bit of a cult-like aspects, or they've got a very strong religious tradition that can lead to toxicity or cult-like aspects, I think they all have problems. And it's, the old Catholic response to that would be, well, it's human nature. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the belief system. But there's, there are a lot of things that still need to be worked out, I think, in these communities.
It is whenever I always, alarm bells go off a little bit when people are trying to create a utopian, because it always starts off with the right idea, like, we should be set apart and there should be, but then I think people kind of ruin it because egos get involved and rules. And because I feel like every time I've told these stories, and I've told a few on this podcast of people who, whose parents or who joined their own kind of community, and then it kind of gets corrupted. It's usually by it's usually an individual that starts to corrupt it. And then too much power is given to some person. And then it's just, I don't know how you avoid that. Anyway, it's fascinating. I'm fascinated by it. I'm fascinated by your story. I'm fascinated that you haven't given up entirely on it. It's not like you went the other direction where, like, I just reject, Catholicism, and, no, it's just you have your own version of it. Well, to skip ahead 20 years, you ended up getting married. You work at Oxford, right? So do you have children?
No
children.
I've never had children. I was 39 when I left. And I did a degree at Oxford University, theology degree, and I absolutely loved. I'm in Oxford now. I really felt at home in Oxford. I'd spent quite a lot of my teenage years in Oxford, actually, because my parents sent me away to a boarding school in Oxford. So I was very at home in Oxford, and I also was able to ask all the questions I hadn't been able to ask, to do all the reading round, so that whereas in the monastery you just read one side of church history and you just read one side of the doctrinal, the doctrines and things, I could read all angles on things and discuss from all angles. I could meet lots of bright people. There are lots of bright, buzzy people who like having discussions. And this was great because discussion was what we couldn't have in the monastery. Everything was shut down. So I really thrived in Oxford, and I really threw myself into my studies, and I really enjoyed it. The other thing about Oxford that was fantastic was all the music, because there are a lot of talented musicians in the university here and in Oxford. And I really was able to revive my viola playing and singing, and to do loads, and I still do loads of music. So I really kind of felt finally, after a few years of feeling, perhaps I should still be a Carmelite, perhaps I should go back. In the end, I just felt I'm able to live a much more complete life here. We're integrating the intellectual, the musical, the creative. And I started writing much more seriously about 10 years ago. And again, the life I have here is one that sort of gives me the opportunity to do that.
You're in the right place. Have you heard back? I know you changed the names of the identities of the nuns in your book, but have you heard back from any of them since the book has been released? Do you think they've even read it, some of them?
I know they have read it, and I've got very, obviously I feel very conflicted about this, but I've been in touch with about 2 or 3 members of the order who they're not a Dakin side. I've been in touch with, I'm very close to some of the Carmelite sisters in one of the other Carmelite houses that I've spent quite a bit of time visiting since I left. And that is probably a house where, had I entered that one earlier, I think I would have fitted in better, and that would have worked out better. So I've got some good Carmelite friends who are still in the order, and 1 or 2 of them have read it and actually really, really appreciate that, they appreciate that I show the light and the shade. Yeah, and that it's a nuanced personal story, and they actually love it. But I know that the Dakin sisters have been sent I didn't send them a copy, but I gather somebody sent them a copy. and I haven't heard back from them. I do feel conflicted because part of me will always feel connected with them. But I've hoped that in the epilogue, I've made it clear that, this is my personal story and it's not a black and white one, but it's a story I felt I needed to tell. And I had some points I needed to make. So, yeah, I haven't been in touch with Akenside for a very long time.
Well, it is such a beautiful book, Catherine Coldstream, Cloistered. It just reads like a great novel. You can't believe this is true, and beautiful details and a real reflection. So thank you so much for sharing your story with the world. And it's just a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I've absolutely loved talking to you.